What kind of man worth billions of dollars would freeze? Because a 7-year-old girl touched his sleeve and asked him to pretend to be her father. The ballroom shimmered in gold and glass, 30 floors above Beverly Hills, where a single table cost more than most people made in a year, where donors in tailored suits and diamond necklaces spoke casually about pledges in the millions as if they were ordering coffee. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Kong, a name spoken carefully in certain circles, a man whose silence could move markets and whose approval could open doors no one else even knew existed. His charcoal suit perfectly cut, his posture still, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room not like a guest but like someone measuring it, controlling it, owning it without ever saying a word, because power like his didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, heavy and undeniable, and yet none of that mattered in the exact second a small hand, warm and slightly trembling, caught the edge of his sleeve, because it didn't belong there, because nothing about it fit into this world of polished marble and whispered deals. And when he looked down, expecting annoyance, expecting inconvenience, expecting security to handle it before he even had to react, he instead found a little girl standing far too still for her age, her dress slightly too big at the shoulders, her shoes worn at the edges like they had already lived a life longer than she had, her eyes not wide with fear but steady, almost calculating, as if she had chosen this moment carefully, as if she had been waiting for him specifically. And then she leaned in just enough so only he could hear her, her voice soft but certain. "Pretend you're my dad, please." And for the first time in years, maybe decades, Ethan Kong didn't respond immediately, didn't dismiss, didn't signal his security, because something in the way she said it didn't sound like a child asking for attention. It sounded like a decision, like a move already made, like a piece already placed on a board he hadn't realized he was part of. And around them the room continued, exactly as it had before, laughter rising, glasses clinking, a woman across the floor smiling too brightly as she discussed a $10 million donation, a waiter passing by with a tray of champagne flutes priced at $500 a bottle, no one noticing that the most controlled man in the room had just stopped moving entirely, his breathing slowing, his focus narrowing, because in a world where he trusted numbers, systems, and leverage, not instinct, not emotion, not strangers, especially not children, there was something profoundly wrong with how unafraid she was, how direct, how deliberate, and as a security guard finally approached from the side, already reaching out to remove her, already assuming she didn't belong here, Ethan's gaze didn't leave her face, not even for a second, because somewhere beneath the polished surface of his control, something small and unfamiliar shifted, not yet a crack, not yet doubt, but enough to make him hesitate, enough to make him not immediately step away, and the girl didn't resist the guard, didn't panic, didn't plead. She simply looked back at Ethan one more time and said, just as quietly, just as clearly, "They're not here for me. They're here for you." And then she let herself be led away as if the moment had already served its purpose, as if the words had already landed exactly where they needed to, leaving behind a silence that only he could feel, in a room where no one else had noticed anything at all. The guard's hand closed gently but firmly around the girl's shoulder, guiding her away from the polished marble floor as if removing a stain that did not belong, and the surrounding guests barely paused, their conversations continuing in smooth, uninterrupted streams about investments, real estate in Seoul, and charity pledges measured in billions of Korean won, as if nothing unusual had occurred, because in rooms like this, anything uncomfortable was simply erased before it could exist. And yet, Ethan Kong did not turn back to his conversation, did not reach for the crystal glass waiting beside him, because the words lingered with an unsettling precision, repeating in his mind with a clarity that refused to fade. "They are not here for me, they are here for you." And it was not fear that bothered him, it was the certainty in her tone, the absence of hesitation, the way she had not looked like a child asking for help but like someone delivering information. And that distinction, subtle as it was, did not align with any pattern he trusted, because Ethan built his world on patterns, predictable behaviors, calculated risks, and yet this moment did not fit into any structure he recognized, and that alone was enough to disrupt the rhythm he maintained so carefully. As one of his associates leaned closer, speaking in a low voice about a shipment schedule crossing Busan ports and Los Angeles distribution timelines, numbers flowing cleanly and logically, but Ethan did not respond immediately, his attention drifting instead toward the far end of the ballroom where the girl had been taken. now standing near a service corridor under the soft glow of recessed lighting, her small figure still, her posture unchanged, as if she had not just been removed from a room she clearly did not belong in, and that lack of reaction created a second fracture in his perception, because children reacted, they cried, they resisted, they sought attention, but she did none of those things, she simply waited, and the guard who had escorted her spoke briefly to another staff member, pointing toward the exit as if deciding where to send her next, and for a moment Ethan considered dismissing it entirely, returning to the flow of the evening, to the structure he controlled, to the certainty that had defined his success. But then something small shifted again, not an emotion he could name, not yet, but enough to make him lift his hands slightly. A minimal gesture that his head of security recognized instantly, stepping closer without drawing attention. His voice barely audible, asking if there was a concern, and Ethan paused just long enough to consider how to phrase something that sounded irrational even in his own mind, before finally saying, "Keep an eye on the exits," nothing more, nothing specific, because he refused to admit that a child's whisper had altered his assessment of the room, and yet the order was given, and it changed the invisible structure of the evening in ways no one else could see, additional eyes shifting subtly, positions adjusting without disruption. The quiet expansion of awareness that always followed his instinct even when he did not fully trust it. And across the room the girl's gaze lifted again, meeting his from a distance that should have felt impossible. And in that brief moment there was no fear, no confusion, only recognition, as if she had expected this exact response, as if she had predicted not just his hesitation, but the precise way he would act on it without acknowledging it. And that realization unsettled him more than anything she had said, because it suggested a level of understanding that should not exist in someone her age. And as the music resumed its steady rhythm and a new wave of applause filled the room for a speaker announcing another donation in the range of 12 billion won, Ethan Kong remained perfectly still, outwardly composed, internally recalibrating, because for the first time in a long time, he was no longer certain that he was the one controlling the situation. Outside the polished surface of the ballroom, beyond the glass walls that reflected nothing but wealth and controlled smiles, the night air over Beverly Hills carried a quiet tension that did not belong to celebration, and parked along the curb, nearly invisible among a row of black luxury vehicles. A matte sedan sat with its engine idling, its interior dim except for the soft glow of a tablet screen casting pale light across two figures who did not look like guests, because they were not, and, on that screen, a small blinking signal pulsed steadily, mapped precisely onto the layout of the hotel, moving just slightly as if adjusting its position, and one of the men leaned forward, his voice calm, almost bored as he spoke in fluent English with a faint trace of Korean inflection. "She is inside. The signal is stable," while the other nodded without surprise, replying that the timing remained within expectation, that everything was proceeding according to design, and neither of them questioned how a child had become the center of such a controlled operation, because to them she was not a child in that moment, she was a variable, a key placed exactly where it needed to be, and back inside, where the music softened into something elegant and forgettable, where a speaker continued discussing cross-border investments between Seoul and Los Angeles in terms of trillions of Korean won. Amara Johnson stood near the service corridor exactly where she had been left, her small fingers resting lightly against the wall as if grounding herself, her eyes scanning the room not with curiosity but with intention, tracking movement, noting patterns, counting again, always counting, because she had learned that time was the only thing no one could fake, and the staff member assigned to escort her out hesitated, distracted by a call on his earpiece, turning away for just a moment, and in that moment she stepped half a pace to the side, just enough to see past the corner into the main hall again, just enough to find Ethan Kong where he had not moved, where he still stood surrounded by power that now felt slightly misaligned, as if the room itself had shifted without anyone noticing, and far across that distance their eyes met again. And this time there was something different in his gaze, something less certain, not fear, not even concern, but awareness, the beginning of a recalculation he could not yet fully define, while from her perspective nothing had changed, because she had already accounted for this, already predicted the delay, the hesitation, the subtle adjustment of security, positions that now unfolded quietly around him, and in her mind the sequence continued exactly as expected. 30 seconds became 25, then 20, each second measured without visible movement, while Ethan, still unaware of the full structure forming around him, felt an unfamiliar weight pressing against his instincts, because everything in the room appeared normal, every guest accounted for, every exit monitored, every system intact, and yet the certainty he relied on was no longer absolute. It was fractured by something too small to justify but too precise to ignore, and as he finally turned slightly toward his head of security again, about to issue a second instruction he had not planned to give, the overhead lights flickered for the briefest moment, so subtle most guests did not notice, but long enough for those trained to see patterns to recognize that it did not belong. And in that instant, Ethan Kong realized that whatever this was, it had already begun before he ever noticed it, and somewhere within that realization, the memory of a quiet voice returned with unsettling clarity. "They are not here for me, they are here for you." And for the first time in years, the man who controlled everything felt the exact edge of something he could not yet control at all. The flicker overhead lasted less than a second, so brief that most of the room dismissed it as nothing more than a minor electrical fluctuation. A detail unworthy of attention in a space designed to erase imperfection. And yet Ethan Kong did not look up at the lights. He looked across the room, directly at the small figure near the service corridor, because in that exact fraction of time, she had not flinched, had not reacted at all. And that absence of reaction became more significant than the flicker itself, because it suggested expectation, not surprise, and expectation meant knowledge, and knowledge meant intent. And those were not qualities he associated with a child, especially not one who should not have been inside this building in the first place. And as the ambient music resumed its steady rhythm and the host on stage continued speaking about international partnerships between Seoul and Los Angeles, referencing numbers in the range of 15 billion Korean won with practiced ease, Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal a change in posture, a transition from passive observation to active evaluation. And beside him his head of security noticed immediately, adjusting his stance, waiting for instruction that had not yet been spoken, because Ethan was not ready to commit to a conclusion. Not yet, not when the variables still refused to align cleanly. And across the room Amara Johnson lowered her gaze briefly, her small hand brushing against the plastic bracelet at her wrist as if confirming something only she could feel, and then she looked up again, not at the exits, not at the guards, but at Ethan, holding that connection with a calm that felt out of place in a world built on hierarchy and control. And for the first time, Ethan did not look away first, because something inside him, subtle but undeniable, had begun to shift, not a loss of control, but the recognition that control itself might be incomplete, that there were elements in motion he had not initiated, and that realization carried a weight he had not experienced in years, because his entire structure depended on awareness, on anticipating every angle before it could develop. And yet here, in a room he had already assessed as secure, a child had introduced a variable that did not belong to any system he trusted. And as he finally spoke again, his voice low, measured, directed only to the man beside him, he said quietly, "Check the internal systems, discreetly, no disruption." And the instruction moved through the security network like a ripple beneath the surface, unseen but effective, technicians receiving silent alerts, systems scanning for irregularities that should not exist, while on stage applause rose again for another announced contribution, this one nearing 20 billion Korean won, and the contrast between visible celebration and invisible recalibration sharpened the tension that only a few could feel. And in that same moment, the staff member who had been responsible for escorting Amara away returned his attention to her, reaching out again to guide her toward the exit, his tone polite but firm, explaining that she needed to leave the event, that this was not a place for her to remain. And she did not resist, did not argue, but as she turned, her voice reached Ethan once more, softer than before, almost lost beneath the music, but clear enough to reach him. "You are late." And the words struck differently than anything she had said before, because they were not a warning, they were an evaluation, as if she had been measuring his response against an expected timeline and found it lacking. And in that instant, something deeper shifted within him, something that was no longer just curiosity or calculation, but the first real fracture in his certainty, because for a moment, just a moment, Ethan Kong realized that he was no longer ahead of the situation, and he did not know when that had changed. The words "you are late" did not echo loudly in the room, but they settled into Ethan Kang's mind with a weight that no public accusation ever could, because they carried no emotion, no fear, no urgency, only certainty, and certainty from a child in a situation she should not understand created a fracture that logic alone could not seal. And as the staff member gently guided Amara Johnson toward the side corridor leading to the service exit, Ethan's gaze followed her movement with a focus that began to override everything else in the room, the music, the applause, the carefully constructed conversations about expansion into Seoul's financial districts and projections exceeding 25 billion Korean won, all of it fading into background noise as his attention narrowed, not because he had decided she was important, but because he could no longer justify dismissing her, and that shift, subtle but irreversible, marked the first true deviation from the controlled patterns that had defined his decisions for years, and without raising his voice or drawing attention, he made a second, quieter gesture, one that did not summon security but redirected it, a signal that changed the path of one guard near the corridor, positioning him not to remove the girl, but to observe her more closely, to delay rather than conclude, and this time the order carried something different, not command, but inquiry, because Ethan was no longer certain what outcome he wanted, and uncertainty was not something he tolerated easily. And across the room, just before disappearing fully into the corridor, Amara slowed for a fraction of a second, just enough for the guard beside her to adjust his pace, just enough to create a moment where she was not being led but choosing to move, and in that moment she glanced back again, not searching for Ethan, not checking if he was watching, but confirming something internal, as if aligning her actions with a sequence only she could see, and then she stepped forward, disappearing from the main hall into the quieter, narrower space beyond, where the polished marble gave way to simpler flooring and the sound of the event softened into a distant hum, and outside, in the darkened sedan, the blinking signal shifted position again, moving steadily toward the perimeter of the building, and one of the men monitoring it leaned back slightly, noting the change without concern, stating calmly that the subject was moving according to projection, that the delay had been minimal, that the response from the primary target had fallen within acceptable variance, and the other nodded, replying that the next phase would begin once confirmation was complete, their voices steady, detached, because for them this was not a disruption, it was a process unfolding exactly as designed. And back inside, Ethan turned slightly toward his head of security again, his voice still controlled but carrying a sharper edge than before. Find out who brought her in, do not remove her yet, and the instruction moved quickly, efficiently, but beneath it there was a subtle shift in priority that only someone close to him would notice, because this was no longer about maintaining order, it was about understanding an anomaly, and anomalies in Ethan Kang's world were never ignored twice, and as he took a single step forward, breaking from his fixed position for the first time since the event began, the distance between him and the corridor felt longer than it should have, not physically, but conceptually, because for the first time in a long time he was not stepping toward control, he was stepping toward something unknown, and somewhere ahead of him, just beyond the visible structure of the evening, a 7-year-old girl continued moving exactly on time. The corridor beyond the ballroom felt like a different world, quieter, narrower, stripped of the illusion of grandeur that defined the event behind it, and as Amara Johnson walked beside the guard, her steps small but steady, the sound of her shoes against the floor measured and consistent, she did not look around in curiosity the way most children would. She did not ask questions, she did not hesitate, and that absence of uncertainty began to register even to the man escorting her, who slowed slightly, glancing down as if expecting some form of resistance or confusion, but finding none, only a calm that did not match the situation, and behind them, at a distance that was carefully maintained but no longer accidental, Ethan Kang entered the corridor, his presence shifting the space without any need for announcement, the air itself seeming to tighten as his footsteps echoed with quiet precision, and the guard immediately straightened, instinctively aware that this was no longer a routine removal, but something that required attention, and Ethan did not speak at first, did not call out, because he was observing, recalibrating in real time, measuring not just the girl's behavior but the environment around her, the timing of movement, the positioning of staff, the subtle delays that should not exist in a system he had already verified, and in that moment, he realized something that unsettled him more than any direct threat could have. The system was responding, but not to him. It was adjusting to something else, something already in motion before his intervention, and as that realization settled, he closed the distance just enough to speak, his voice low, controlled, directed at the guard but meant for the girl, "Stop here," and the guard obeyed immediately, releasing his light hold as Amara came to a halt without needing guidance, turning slowly to face Ethan, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, and for the first time since this began, He was standing close enough to see details that did not belong to the surface, the faint wear on her sleeve, the slight tension in her fingers, the way her gaze did not flicker or drop under pressure. And it was in those details that something deeper registered, not fearlessness, but familiarity, as if she had been in situations where composure was not a choice but a requirement. And Ethan studied her for a moment longer than necessary, aware that every second of silence carried weight, before finally asking, not harshly, not gently, but with deliberate neutrality, "Who told you to come here?" And the question hung in the corridor, simple in structure but complex in implication, because it assumed instruction, assumed influence, assumed that a child could not operate independently in a situation like this. And Amara did not answer immediately, not because she was thinking, but because she was measuring, aligning his question with something internal. And when she finally spoke, her voice was as calm as before, almost soft, but clear enough to remove any doubt. "No one told me. I came because you would listen," and the statement did not challenge him, it did not accuse, it simply existed. And in that simplicity was a deeper disruption, because it removed the framework he had been trying to apply. There was no handler, no visible direction, no external command, only intent, and intent without origin was something he could not map easily. And as he held her gaze, searching for inconsistency, for hesitation, for anything that would restore the balance he was used to, he found none, and that absence forced a second realization. Quieter but more dangerous than the first, he had already misjudged her once, and the cost of misjudging her again was something he could no longer calculate with certainty. The corridor held its silence after her answer, a silence that did not feel empty but measured, as if the space itself was waiting to see how Ethan Kong would respond. And for a brief moment he did nothing, not because he lacked a reaction but because every instinct he had relied on for years was presenting options that no longer aligned cleanly with the situation in front of him, because if she had been sent, there would be a pattern, a trace, a structure he could dismantle, and if she had wandered in by accident, there would be fear, confusion, something human and predictable, but she was neither, and that absence of category created a gap that logic alone could not close. And behind him, his head of security remained still, waiting, aware that this was no longer a standard assessment but something requiring a different kind of judgment. And Ethan finally shifted slightly, lowering himself just enough to bring his gaze closer to her level without fully kneeling. A controlled adjustment that still maintained distance, because even now, even with uncertainty forming beneath the surface, he did not abandon hierarchy easily, and his voice when he spoke again carried a quieter edge, less about authority and more about precision. "If you came because I would listen, then tell me what I am supposed to hear." And the question was not an invitation, it was a test, a deliberate narrowing of possibilities designed to force inconsistency, to reveal whether she was repeating something or generating it in the moment. And Amara Johnson did not look away, did not search for words. She simply held his gaze with that same calm that continued to disrupt every expectation he had. And then she answered, not quickly, not slowly, but exactly when the moment required it. "You are not paying attention to the right people," and the sentence, simple as it was, carried a weight that shifted something deeper, because it did not warn him of danger, it questioned his awareness. And no one questioned Ethan Kang's awareness, not in his world, not in any room he controlled, and yet here, in a quiet corridor away from the polished illusion of the ballroom, a 7-year-old girl had just implied that his entire assessment of the environment was flawed, and for a fraction of a second, the impulse to dismiss returned, strong, familiar, a reflex built from years of filtering noise from signal, but it did not hold, because the pattern of her behavior, the timing of the flicker, the subtle adjustments in security that had occurred without his initial command, all of it combined into something he could no longer categorize as coincidence. And that recognition did not create fear, but it did create pressure, a tightening of focus that pushed him further into the situation rather than away from it. And as he considered his next move, the small bracelet on her wrist caught his attention again, not because it was unusual in itself, but because of the way her fingers had touched it earlier, briefly, deliberately, and now, as if aware of his observation, she lifted her hand slightly, not hiding it, not emphasizing it, simply allowing it to exist within his line of sight. And in that subtle motion was another layer of intent, not revealing but guiding, and Ethan's gaze sharpened, because that was not the behavior of someone unaware of their surroundings, it was the behavior of someone shaping them. And for the first time since this encounter began, he felt the shift fully register, not just as a disruption, but as a reversal, because whatever this was, whatever sequence had been set in motion before he noticed it, he was no longer the one leading it, and the realization did not show on his face, did not alter his posture, but it settled into his mind with a clarity that could not be ignored, and in that moment Ethan Kong understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. He was not just responding to the situation, he was being moved by it. The moment stretched between them, thin but unbreakable, as Ethan Kong followed the line of her raised wrist. His gaze settling on the simple plastic bracelet that should have meant nothing and yet now carried a significance he could not ignore, because in his world, nothing was ever accidental, not placement, not timing, not even silence, and the way she had allowed him to notice it felt deliberate, controlled, as if she were guiding his attention one step at a time without ever telling him what to see, and that realization pressed deeper into his thoughts, shifting his focus away from the obvious and toward the unseen, toward the possibility that what mattered was not in front of him but around him, embedded in the structure he had already assumed was secure, and behind him his head of security shifted slightly, receiving a quiet update through his earpiece, his posture tightening for just a fraction of a second before returning to stillness, and Ethan caught it immediately, not the words but the change, because he had trained himself to read movement the way others read language, and that subtle reaction confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Something was being detected, something small, something not yet defined, and without turning, without breaking eye contact with the girl, he spoke again, his voice low and precise. Report, and the response came just as quietly, a technician noting an irregular signal within the internal network, not a breach, not a failure, but an anomaly that did not align with expected patterns, and the description, vague as it was, connected instantly with the image in front of him, the bracelet, the timing, the deliberate calm, and for the first time Ethan allowed the possibility to form fully, that the anomaly was not external, it was already inside, already moving, already interacting with his system in ways he had not initiated. And as that thought settled, his attention sharpened further, narrowing not on the girl alone but on the space she occupied, the distance she had traveled, the sequence of moments that had led her here, and each step revealed something he had overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because it had been too small to register until now, and Amara Johnson watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if she had reached the point in the sequence where observation would replace action, where his response would determine what came next, and the balance between them shifted again, subtly but unmistakably, because he was no longer questioning whether she understood the situation. He was questioning how much she understood, and that difference altered everything, and after a brief pause, he asked a different question, one that moved beyond assumption and into confirmation. What is it? And this time her answer came without delay, without hesitation. It is already connected, and the words landed with a clarity that cut through the remaining uncertainty, because they did not describe a future event, they described a present condition, something that had already occurred, something already integrated into his system, and in that instant Ethan's perception adjusted completely, not as a reaction but as a recalibration, a restructuring of priorities that moved the situation from anomaly to active concern. And yet even as that shift took place, something else surfaced beneath it, quieter but more persistent, a recognition that the information he was receiving, fragmented and indirect as it was not coming from his network, it was coming from a child who should not have access to any of it, and that contradiction deepened the fracture in his certainty, because it forced him to confront a possibility he had not allowed before, that the most accurate source of information in the room was not part of his system at all. And as he held her gaze, measuring the weight of that realization, the controlled structure of his world adjusted once more, not collapsing, not yet, but shifting just enough to reveal that its foundation was no longer as absolute as he had believed.